Yes. Good morning and welcome to the officials from the Ministry of Public Utilities, Regulated Industries Commission, and the Auditor General's Department. My name is Devendranath Tanku, and I'm the Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee has a mandate to consider and to report to the House on A, the appropriation accounts of monies expended out of sums granted by Parliament to meet the public expenditure of Trinidad and Tobago. B, such other accounts as may be referred to the committee by the House of Representatives or as are authorized or required to be considered by the committee under any other enactment. And C, the report of the Auditor General on any such accounts. The purpose of this meeting is for the Public Accounts Committee to conduct an examination of the reports of the Auditor General on the financial statements of the Regulated Industries Commission for the financial years 2014 to 2018, to assess whether the RIC's expenditure conforms to the authority which governs it, to examine the challenges being faced and possible solutions to those challenges, and to assist the RIC in achieving the efficient execution of its mandate while ensuring that expenditure is embarked upon in accordance with parliamentary approval. Based on these issues, the following representatives were invited to today's public hearing: the Ministry of Public Utilities, the Regulated Industries Commission, and the Auditor General's Department. Please note that this meeting is being broadcast live on Parliament's Channel 11, on Radio 105.5 FM, and the Parliament's YouTube channel, ParlView. Viewers and listeners are welcome and invited to send their comments related to today's inquiry via email, pal101@ttparliament.org, facebook.com/ttparliament, or Twitter @ttparliament. I will now invite members of the Public Accounts Committee to present and introduce yourselves to the members of the media and your colleagues here present, starting on my right, my colleague.
Jillian John, Vice Chairman of the Committee.
Dr. Amy Brown, member of the committee, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Paula Gopi-Stone, member.
Good morning, Hazel Thompson-Ahi, member.
Good morning, Roger Monroe, member.
Thank you. We also have present members of the Secretariat of the Public Accounts Committee. I will now invite representatives present from the various institutions here to introduce themselves, beginning with the Ministry of Public Utilities.
Good morning, Chairman and members. I am Nicolette Duke, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Public Utilities.
Good morning, Chairman, Vice Chair, members. I'm Daniel Salandi, Administrator, Legal Services, Ministry of Public Utilities.
Good morning, members. My name is Curtis Augustine, Ministry of Public Utilities, Monitoring and Evaluation Coordinator.
Thank you. Can members from the Regulated Industries Commission introduce yourselves, please?
Good morning, Chairman.
Press.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Vice Chairman, and members of the committee. I am Dawn Callender, Chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission.
Good morning, Dr. Michelle Salandi, Executive Director of the RIC.
Good morning, Chairman and members. I'm Carol Balkaran, Deputy Executive Director, Regulated Industries Commission.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I am Shamil Khan, Chief Financial Officer, Regulated Industries Commission.
Good morning, I'm Derek Phillips, Assistant Executive Director, Regulated Industries Commission.
Good morning, members. I'm Donna Chapman, Manager, HR and Administration, Regulated Industries Commission.
Thank you. And from the Auditor General's Department, we have?
Good morning, Gary Peters, Assistant Auditor General.
Good morning, Anisha Bash, Audit Director.
Thank you. I now invite the Auditor General Department, that is the Assistant Auditor General who is with us present, to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning to members of the committee, ministry officials, and officials from the RIC. And members of the viewing public, sorry. The Regulated Industries Commissions Act, Section 34, subsection 2 states, the accounts of the Commission shall be audited annually by the Auditor General or by an auditor authorized by him for such purpose. For the years under consideration this morning, the audits were conducted by a private firm. But it doesn't end there. Before we issue our covering report, we actually go look at the auditor's working papers to ensure that everything has been, that was supposed to be done in accordance with the contract is actually done. Thank you.
Good morning again, Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the committee, members of the RIC, Auditor General. Thank you for affording the Ministry of Public Utilities the opportunity to join this discussion as it relates to the audited financial statements of the Regulated Industries Commission. In the execution of its role as an independent regulator, the RIC contributes to the Ministry's thrust to enhance the quality of life of the citizens, as well as the country's overall economic and social development through the provision of reliable, high-quality public utility services. The Ministry therefore looks forward to today's discussion and any recommendations that will enable us to further our efforts, along with our key partners, to meet this critical need of all citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite the Executive Director of the RIC to make a brief opening statement. Sorry, I think we have the Chairman. Sorry, my apologies. My apologies, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I recognize you and the Vice Chairman, members of the committee, our colleagues from the Ministry of Public Utilities and the Auditor General Department, and of course the wider viewing public. RIC is pleased to appear before this August committee to respond to important questions concerning its mandate and its operations. We consider ourselves a learning organization, and thus we're always interested in receiving feedback from our stakeholders. In this context, the RIC will welcome the insights and recommendations that would result from this morning's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. The way the committee usually proceeds is I will begin by asking a few questions, you will respond, etc., and then my colleagues, I will open up the floor so my colleagues will also engage the committees, the various institutions present here today. So allow me to begin with the first set of questions, please. According to your submission to the Commission, the RIC that is, you sent something to us, and on page 15 of it, it says that the RIC Act clearly specifies the RIC's powers and functions. However, the RIC recognizes that these powers and functions may need to be updated in light of new developments in the utilities sector, including introducing renewable energy. The RIC is addressing its concerns surrounding these powers with the Ministry of Public Utilities. It continues on page 16 of that same submission of the RIC to the Public Accounts Committee that the RIC proposes amendments to its primary legislation to improve operational efficiency and its ability to effectively regulate the sectors under its purview. Now, I have looked at your previous strat plans and I've looked at your submissions to the Public Accounts Committee. Then this requirement and the need for legislative adjustments and legislative changes was identified in your 2010 to 2014 strat plan, in your 2016 to 2018 strat plan, and we are still talking about the need for legislative review. Can you advise whether legislative amendments or proposed amendments to the RIC Act has been in fact prepared, and if so, have they been submitted to the Ministry of Public Utilities for its review and therefore subsequent action?
The RIC has indeed prepared a document which would include the amendments, the suggested or the proposed amendments to the RIC Act, alongside a policy document that's basically a companion of the amendments to the MPU for its review. And that has been done, well, it was previously submitted early on in 2016. It was again resubmitted in 2021 alongside changes in the realm of what's happening in the utility sector in terms of RE. So that has been submitted.
Thank you. Madam Executive Director, you indicated that it was submitted in 2016 and then in 2021 it was resubmitted?
Alongside further, because again, it was reviewed again, and alongside further changes, there were submissions. Again, this came with the review of the feed-in tariff policy, etc. So the Regulated Industries Commission would have provided additional comments.
Thank you. Question to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Planning and Ministry of Public Utilities. Ma'am, we just heard that submissions were made based on concerns that the RIC had with regards to expanding its mandate, and that has been submitted to you in 2016 and revised and resubmitted in 2021. Can you advise whether the ministry is currently considering, in fact, let's go the other way. Can you advise what's the current status of those recommendations from the RIC?
Yes, Chairman. Those recommendations were received, and they are being considered in conjunction with proposed legislative changes or amendments to the TNTech Act as well. All of these fall within the ambit of the ministry's analysis of power generation and transmission. So there are a number of pieces of legislation that impact that, including the RIC Act, and they're all being considered together. I'll have the admin legal elaborate a bit more.
Thank you.
Good day, Chair. Currently, the Ministry of Public Utilities has completed an overarching policy for power generation. As the PS has rightly stated, this overarching policy not only includes amendments to the RIC legislation, but also to the TNTech legislation, the electoral inspectorate legislation as well. The ministry has had stakeholder engagements on the policy thus far, and they have completed the second draft, which will go before Cabinet shortly. Thank you.
Madam Pierce, I assume that you have a very good relationship with the RIC and that you are in constant conversations with each other. So we are hopeful that these amendments, these proposed legislative changes would be presented in the shortest possible time frame, especially given that the RIC has been complaining about this for quite a while, since 2010, I believe it was. In fact, since that 2010-2014 strat plan, it was a focus of the RIC. Yes?
Yes, Chairman. We are really working hard at trying to put this before Cabinet in the shortest possible time. One of the things about these types of legislation is because there are so many nuances from one to the next. You really want to ensure that you get it right. And then with the advent of RE and the feed-in tariff, you want to make sure that you consider all the stakeholders in the process. We believe that in the consultations that we have incorporated the key stakeholders, and their comments have been incorporated into the policy. And so we are thinking that within the shortest time frame, before the end of this fiscal year, we should have had that in Cabinet and possibly, well, on Cabinet's timetable, had some feedback as to how we proceed from there.
Thank you very much, Madam Pierce. And that feeds into my area of concern, because although I'm not aware of what the contents of the recommendations are, based on the strat plan, etc., I saw the direction in which they were seeking to go. And I want to use that to springboard of something that my colleague from the Auditor General's Department raised, Section 34 of the Act. Section 34 of the Act, to expand based on what the Assistant Auditor General raised. Section 34 of the Act states, and this is 34.3, the Commission shall, not later than 6 months after the end of the preceding year, submit to the Minister in respect of the preceding financial year a copy of the audited statements of accounts and an annual report in respect of the preceding year. Clause 4, Section 4. The Minister shall cause a copy of the annual report of the audited statement to be laid before the Parliament within 28 days of his receipt of the report, and if Parliament is not in session, then within 28 days of the commencement of this next session. Where am I going with that? We have had reports from the RIC in which it stated that the 2020 audited financial statements were expected to be done on or before the 31st of December 2023. The financial statements for 2021 were to be submitted for auditing at the end of December 2023. So that's not the financial statements, the audited financial statements being submitted to the ministry. And the audited for fiscal 2022 and 2023 will follow with the expectations that it's going to be finished in the first half of 2024. As an entity with the responsibility of setting targets, implementing rules of law, in fact providing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, providing structures and penalties for failure to abide by law. It is of grave concern to me and to my colleagues here that we seem to have a hiccup in the submission of your financial statements on time as is required by law. Is it that, and maybe you can now advise, is it that there's in fact it was highlighted in the management letters to the RIC on several occasions, which I have had sight of, on several occasions, that there's this lethargy when it comes to submitting financial statements for consideration and for audit. The 2019 management letter, if I may share, because I want to give you as much, I want to give members of the public as much information as possible and yourself as possible, so you can respond with regards to a solution. The observation in the management letter of 2019 was that there has been a very long period between the completion of all audit work and the approval and eventual sign-off of the financial statements, which resulted in rework and additional procedures to be performed. There's a risk that rework and additional time spent will, over the budgeted hours, lead to higher audit fee. The 2019 management letter made a recommendation: a more efficient process for the review and approval of the financial statements should be implemented to ensure a smoother flow of work and to avoid overruns in the audit fee. Given the experience of delay in the submission of financial statements, not just financial statements for audit, but financial statements as by extension to the minister, and therefore to the Parliament, and therefore to your committee, can you advise what has been the reason for this persistent backlog in the preparation of financial statements over the years?
Chairman, I should begin by saying that we also as a board, we share the concerns of not having our financial statements submitted on time, and that we are taking steps to address that. So apparently the delay actually was something that occurred prior to my board assuming responsibility there. So in fact, we met a backlog. I took that chairmanship in 2019. At that time, 2016 was being done. However, as I said, we have taken ownership of the process. We have completed the 2020 statements recently. We used a different approach in moving from the draft financials to the completely signed off financials. And I can say to you that even though we had committed there to do it by December the 31st, we actually had to go through some, I don't know, I don't want to call them extra procedures, but sometimes getting third-party confirmations and so on, those things can be a little time protracted. But we put all efforts into getting it done, and we recently signed those statements. I think it may have been last week Friday or maybe Monday this week. We were able to meet the standard for the 2021 statements in that we have submitted them to the auditors, and they are in the process of being audited. We expect them perhaps within the next month that those will be completed, and we will move immediately thereafter to do the 2022 and 2023 as we have submitted. So if I were to say the reason for them being late, to some extent, we inherited a delay, notwithstanding our commitment. We've experienced, I don't even want to bring into the discussion COVID and so on. But those things did occur. But most of all, I think the commitment of the board to get them ready and taking ownership to get them up to date is there. And we will actually achieve that by the first half of this year.
Ma'am, are you saying that you will be current with the exception of 2023 as at the first half, at the end of the first half? Is this fiscal or calendar?
No, this is calendar. So we would be we're talking about June the 30th, 2024. We will certainly be completed with 2022. And it is our intention really to do 2023 by that date as well. But certainly 2022 will be brought up to date by that time.
So I just want for clarification. This is for the Commission to provide its audited financial or to provide its statements for auditing?
No. Audited financials.
All right.
We will complete them by that date in June.
In your consideration for legislative changes, have you considered increasing the time frame required for the provision of these statements? Because even if you are finished with 2021, 2022, and 2023, the requirement as in law now is a maximum of about 7 months between when you submit your audited financial statements to the minister. So that's your time frame. You have 6 months to submit your audited financial, but at the end of the financial year. Admittedly, it seems to be a challenge. Let me ask the question then. What action do you think is required, or do you think that you've put enough things in place to ensure that we do not have a repeat of delays in the submission of financial statements for auditing and in the submission of the audited financial statements to the Ministry, to the Parliament, and to the Public Accounts Committee?
No, so Chair, I would not want an extension. I think having a time period of 6 months is quite appropriate. The fact that we have not met it means that we have to really review ourselves and to meet that deadline. We have made some changes. So, for example, we had an issue that required a lot of reconciliations to be done, and we actually did that work. So now that we find that moving forward, it's a lot smoother than it was before. So I think we are committed to meet the standard, and we will put all our efforts into so doing.
Can you advise, now I'm aware that the 2014 to 2018 financial statements was audited by a firm appointed by yourselves with the approval of the Auditor General's Department, and that was in keeping with Section 34 of the Act itself. Can you advise of the cost of these audits? That's the 2014 to 2018, which is really the period that we are supposed to focus on.
With your permission here, I will ask our CFO, who was there during that period, to respond to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The annual cost was $85,000.
Thank you. Can you advise as to whether or not that annual cost was increased or higher because of the fact that there were late submissions or delays in submissions?
In certain cases where additional work was required, there were slight overruns. In one case, it was by about $10,000. But other than that, it was in line with the $85,000 fee.
Last question before I pass on to my colleagues. Is it then that the RIC does not have, let me ask the question differently again. Is the RIC sufficiently staffed and resourced, in your opinion? I'll ask this to Madam Chairman. Is the RIC sufficiently staffed and resourced, in your opinion, to effectively and efficiently ensure at least, this question is purely with regards to financial statements, at least that the audited financial statements are prepared in the time as required by the Act?
So, Chairman, I would say yes. So the difficulty that I would say occurred is that we actually inherited a backlog. That situation was made it was worsened by COVID and, persons not being in the office and so on. I think apart from that, because of the commitment we made as a board, the statements otherwise would really have been up to date now. So I don't think it's really an issue of staffing. Everybody always wants more resources and so on. But I would say that we have taken a very proactive approach. We follow up differently with the auditors now. We ask them to turn around the drafts for us more quickly. And as members of the board, we've all committed that our review should be quite timely. So I also look forward, just given my own background, to having up-to-date and current financial statements. And so we are holding ourselves, I wouldn't even say to a high standard, the standard that we should achieve, and it is our intention to do that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mrs. Callender, you sounded very impressive. I felt confident that you would meet the goals that you've set yourself. But then you go and spoil it all, like the song say, by saying the word "I think." So I'm sure you would agree with me that you are going to withdraw that "I think" and say we are committed to meet the standards. Because "I think" spoiled it all, just like the song said.
Absolutely. We are committed. And this commitment is not solely my commitment, it's the commitment of the board. We have been engaging different techniques. Those techniques we are quite well supported by our executive director and our CFO in meeting those standards. So yes, our commitment is there. Thank you.
I'm comforted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask a few questions about service standards. I am aware that there are service standards that are applicable to Tea and Tech at this time, and there are service standards penalties that apply. You can correct me if I'm wrong when you're responding. I want to know if there are similar service standards for WASA, and have they been gazetted? What's the situation with regard to your service standards for those two particular entities? Thank you.
The quality of service standards, they exist for Tea and Tech, as you asked, and in regard to WASA, there has been continuous engagement with WASA and outside and external stakeholders as well in terms of consumers. That quality of service standards actually has been resubmitted, I would say, after all of the engagement. December 19th, 2023, and it's now submitted for gazetting. But at this current time, quality of service standards for WASA it's not officially published just yet because we await gazetting.
I would imagine that responsibility for gazetting and so on is with the Ministry of Public Utilities. Perhaps PS
yes.
can tell us where is that, and then I would further want to go into your enforcement policy framework inquiring, because they go hand in hand, whether or not your enforcement policy framework is in place as well. Thank you.
Yes, member, we are in receipt at the Ministry of the Quality of Service Standards for WASA. The Ministry is now preparing, normally when we get these quality of service standards, we prepare a note to Cabinet so that Cabinet is informed of the standard. And once we get the approval, we move to the gazetting. So we are at this time preparing that note.
And I expect in the interest of the customer that will be expedited.
Quite so, Minister.
Quite so. But then, of course, there's the enforcement policy framework. And I know that there was a commitment to review and implement a compliance and enforcement policy framework for both WASA and TNTech. What is the status of that?
Sorry. So in order to have the compliance framework, one must have the standards gazetted and taken effect. I think just one clarification, the submission that we did in December 2023 was actually a fine-tuning of submissions that had been made prior. So in the case of TNTech, where those standards have been gazetted and accepted, there are a number of reports that TNTech must produce to the RIC annually, things like their codes of practice, certain some of the provisions in the standards that were gazetted, what percentage compliance they have achieved, and so that is done annually in the case of TNTech and would be done in the case of WASA once the standards actually are gazetted, in which case they then become effective for WASA's compliance.
Good. So in the case of TNTech, are they in compliance? And if not, is there some kind of enforcement policy to ensure that they comply with the service standards which have been set and agreed on by the Ministry and Cabinet?
Okay, I know we have some details on that, and I'll just let our ED respond to that. Thanks.
In relation to the quality of service standards for TNTech, there are two components, the guaranteed standards and the overall standards. The guaranteed standards are specific to basically individual service standards that must be met for the individual customer, where overall standards basically exist where it can't meet particular specifics of an individual customer, but relate to all customers in totality. Relating to the standards, the general electricity standards, there are 8 of them. The first one, in terms of the compensatory payments, in terms of enforcement, that is of the 8 standards, the only standard in which it's not an automatic payment, but for the remaining standards, GS2 to GS8, those standards, the payments are automatic in terms of the compensation to customers for any breaches therein. And the RIC would publish standards annually. I can probably give you an example of how TNTech is in terms of there. In relation to GS1, which is regarding response and restoration time of an unplanned outage within 10 hours, the TNTech in terms of the percentage for compliance is almost 100. It's between 99.5 in 2014 to 99.9 in 2015, a slight dip to 99.76% in terms of TNTech's compliance. I just go down to another, GS5 is in terms of investigation of voltage complaints. TNTech is required to respond to all voltage complaints within 24 hours. And in 2018, they had a maximum in terms of keeping to that standard of 100%. and in 2014, 99.9. There's standards in regards to billing punctuality, and for most of these standards, their compliance level has been between in the late 90s and very close to 100, and in some cases, 100% compliance.
What is the system in place to review? What system is in place in terms of the review of the compliance? When is it done? Because you're referring to 2014, it's a long time now, right? So what system is in place? I would imagine it's that enforcement policy framework, is that it?
Yes. What we do is the same standards I'm just recalling here, they actually are current, and the same quality in terms of the same percentage levels exist today. So every annually, these reports are out and they are kept current as we do collate the information from TNTech, and we do publish so that in terms of the transparency, all customers, any stakeholder can actually go onto the RIC website and look at the quality of service standards reporting. There's actually another one that will be released, let's say by next month, because it will be sent to the board for approval. So that's one area that we consistently look at to ensure that
Just to go back to the WASA service standard, so there is an existing service standard that is being revised, right. Is that it?
Okay, so the WASA service standard, that one is currently, it was submitted firstly in December 2004 for gazetting. At that time, it went for gazetting. The questions arose in terms of I would say, need for clarification, need for some areas to be reworked, along with the major stakeholder, their WASA. The RIC would have looked at the comments received and would have resubmitted for publication in 2010. Again, at that point in time, there was some issue in terms of agreement in terms of meeting the standards. The RIC reviewed, took all the, I would say, suggestions, recommendations, and the views of the stakeholders, and would have reviewed it again and resubmitted. We most recently met with WASA to look at different areas, because the one thing that the RIC would want to do in terms of having those standards is to ensure that customers receive a high level of service. So there are minimum requirements that must be achieved. So we looked at to ensure that customers get value in terms of their service, and that to ensure that the service provider is able to do so. So we reviewed it one more time and it's sent. So at this point, that it's not gazetted, until they are gazetted, then they become effective.
Right, I understand that, but my final question before I allow my colleagues, My final question before I pass on to my colleagues, are your service standards benchmarked against some international or regional levels? And then I pass on.
As with all of the RIC's determinations on any area standards in terms of quality of service, it's always two-sided, because we look at international benchmarks, and then we have to look at it into relation of the context of Trinidad and Tobago, the company here, basically our regulatory environment and our economic context. So it is benchmarked internationally within the region, in terms of the Caribbean region, and again, given those benchmarking in terms of our local context, so yes.
If I may, before we go further, you just said something that was very interesting. You benchmark based on international standards, but you take the local conditions, etc., local context into consideration. Is your local context in terms of the requirement for service by the customer, the final customer, or is your local content based on your local considerations based on the status or the state or the capability of the organization itself? So is your service standard based on the organization or the individual service required?
The RIC and its consultation takes the views of all stakeholders, and that includes the stakeholder, which would be the utility, and the stakeholders, which are the customers. So in terms of the local environment, the customers have a very major part in influencing and guiding the RIC in terms of making its final decisions in these areas. And the RIC would look at it in terms of local context, because the RIC has a customer service management database. So all of the complaints that come in that we receive from customers over the years, all of those things, in addition to when we put it out for public comment, those collate together and combine to influence and guide the decisions of the RIC.
Now, I know my colleague has some concerns about
May I just say that part of what we do is that we are interested in the service providers improving. So notwithstanding that something may be a little bit difficult for them, we are still likely to put in there what would be called, in a way, a stretch target, meaning that you really should go a bit beyond your comfort zone of where you are now and get closer to the standards that we feel our consumers should enjoy. Part of the consultation process allows the utility to understand the thinking of the RIC even before those standards are published. So we always say to them, you know what our thinking is, you know where we want to go, so please begin to review your internal processes so that when it's gazetted and when it comes into effect, you will actually be able to meet these standards. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's the right direction in any case. Now we have T&Tech. You have the enforcement policy already in place for T&Tech, is that correct? In terms of enforcement, what exactly does RIC, what power does RIC have in terms of enforcement of a quality of standard, a standard of service? If T&Tech, for example, does not provide that benchmark, what recourse does RIC have? What is that enforcement policy?
The enforcement with the quality of service standards, as they are gazetted, they are now outside of GES1. And in terms of the others, the enforcement is actually, the compensation is automatic. So that actually occurs if there is a case in which a payment is, let's say a payment is not made, or for whatever reason, the RIC will then follow up with the utility.
Thank you. Who determines the compensation? So in the event, just for the clarification, I think of the view in public, if I have a surge in power supply and my appliances are damaged, is that what the enforcement treats with? There's a valuation of some sort. Is that the enforcement? The enforcement, I assume, would be whether if T&Tech does not provide reimbursement. You understand the question?
I understand the question. That question will probably go more out in terms of the specifics of a damaged appliance, will probably go outside of the specific standards that we have there in terms of the rebate program, or the rebate, I shouldn't say program, but given a rebate. And I think my Assistant Executive Director for Technical Operations would possibly give you a more detailed response to that question.
Good morning again. So for a situation where appliances are damaged for a customer, they would normally file a claim with the utility, and the utility will investigate, and hopefully it's settled at that level. If that does not occur and the customer is not satisfied, then they could refer their complaints to the RIC, and we will investigate to see if the utility was at fault. And if we find that they were at fault because of, negligence or something that they were supposed to have done and they didn't do, then we will rule in that regard and notify the utility that we believe that they are liable and they should make compensation to the customer.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very, 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 very important thing, because of recent, we have had multiple fluctuations of power supply. But I'm not aware that substantial numbers of members of the public are aware of this option of proceeding in the event that TNTech does not engage them. So there's a sort of give up by members of the public that nothing will happen, even if their appliances are damaged. Madam Chair, the question is to you. Are you satisfied that sufficient advertising of RIC's role in terms of enforcement of this particular sort of service? Their role is, are you comfortable in your level of advertising so that members of the public are aware that this exists, that they can pursue TNT and have it not gotten through, that there is in fact another option that they could pursue for resolution?
Mr. Chair, I would say I'm not satisfied, and I think one of the learnings that we took away from the consultations that we held last year was that the public is really unaware of the RIC's roles and functions and so on. There really was a low level of awareness, and now, sadly, people only know us as the people who come in to increase their rates and not some of the other work that we do. There is actually knowledge by a large section of the public about the RIC work. They come to our customer service department. We've gotten a lot of rebates and other things for them. But I certainly think that that should be improved and expanded, and every consumer should know about the RIC's role. But with respect to the concerns expressed across the consultations, we actually met with TNTech, gave them some of the feedback we got regarding different services that they should provide to the public. We have a commitment from them that they would also be engaging in public education. And that is something that we will follow up over the course of this review period that we just completed.
Sure.
In your report to us, you mentioned customer complaints. And you enumerated some of them: interruption in pipe-borne water supply, street lights, repair and installation, request for truck-borne water supply, leaks, billing inquiries. Now, you submitted 2014 and 2015. When I look at the figures, I find them extremely low. And I'm wondering, though, can you tell us how accurate these figures are? Because if one is to take the pulse of the society, by just listening to the talk shows, and you hear all of these complaints about all of the utilities, the utility bodies under your jurisdiction, figure like 2,390 for the whole year, 2,231, and you've said that you resolved like 86%, 88%. I mean, is this real? Are we really to think that this is what is happening in this society today? What has happened since 2016, 2023? Has there been a dramatic increase in the number of complaints received and resolved? And those that have been resolved, unresolved at the end of the year, is it possible they resolve in another year? I find it very, more than passing strange. The numbers that you've submitted.
Yes.
Can you explain?
Yes, member. So those numbers are accurate in the sense that those are the persons who have come to the RIC for redress. Now, I agree with you. It certainly doesn't seem reflective of what we hear in the wider public, and especially now on social media. So one of the things that we have started doing is that we have persons who are now canvassing social media from time to time, because very often, that's where someone will go to vent their concerns or to look for some sort of redress. So we do now sort of poll what's happening in social media, and we give feedback to WASA in the same way. But certainly, we are also very concerned about the level of service that the consumers are enjoying, particularly, I think, on the water side. And we would like to see that improved. We always give that feedback to WASA and meet with them quite regularly. So, this is what we have in terms of things coming through us, but unlikely to be reflective of the customer's experience.
Thank you. I appreciate your honesty.
Just by way of follow-up and welcome once again, appreciate the responses provided thus far to the questions from the committee. I have a few follow-up questions on the issue of complaints, seeing that this forms treatment, investigation and treatment of complaints forms an important part of the RIC's mandate. And I did take note of content in your submissions, your financial statements and annual reports, where you track and present data on complaints. So you would have presented complaints received, resolved, withdrawn. I was very interested in the column of complaints withdrawn. So I wanted a little more insight from you on how do you receive complaints. I know that there are several programs, even on radio, focused on getting members of the public to call in and give and register comments or concerns about experiences with some of which would fall under the industries that you regulate. So is that part of your source of complaints? What really constitutes a complaint? How do you pursue investigations? Is it in-house? Do you utilize consultants or other service providers? And is that something that is paid for separately? And then complaints resolved. I join with my colleague member who spoke a little earlier. But my take is I'm very pleased to see that a significant number of the complaints you would be tracking are being resolved from year to year. I would like some insight into what do you consider a resolved complaint. I'll give you an example. If I take my car to the mechanic and I have a complaint, he didn't sort out some system, and he tinkers a little further, and then you ask him, he would say, yes, he's resolved the problem. And you ask me, the initial complainant, I may have a different view of it. So for you to categorize a complaint as having been resolved, what goes into that, and does that entail feedback from the client or the complainant as well? So let's start with that, and maybe I'll have one very minor supplemental question.
Remember, I will just give a little context, but I'll have my executive director expand. One of the things that we should remember is that the RIC only comes into play after the person has exhausted their efforts with the utility provider. So even though we are hearing some of the concerns being expressed, like on the radio, as I said, we've asked that people look and see what's happening on social media, Facebook, and so on. Those are not things that the RIC can interact with directly, but what we have been doing is that we will draw them to the attention of the service provider to ensure that they are engaging with the complainant, so to speak, yes? So those are not ones that we can, the law doesn't allow us to interact with those persons unless they've exhausted their efforts, yeah? But I'll have the executive director give some more details.
The RIC receives complaints via several channels. Again, firstly, we actually have our customer service staff ready and available for walk-ins. So persons can actually come in and make their complaint. They can make an appointment beforehand and come in. to make that complaint face-to-face, because we know that some persons prefer that one-on-one interaction when they do have their issues. In addition to that, you can actually send the RIC your complaint via email or just call. We have an 800 number, so it's toll-free. And again, with the advent of COVID, the RIC have adapted and had a WhatsApp number, so persons could also feel free to WhatsApp us their complaints. And we use social media. So if you we would advertise, tell persons how they can complain, what they can complain about, and the process for making a complaint, so that when they do come in, it's also very smooth in terms of that process. As the chairman would have indicated, we would identify to customers that we are the second call for redress. So the first step is to make the complaint to your service provider. And if you are not satisfied with your result, then you come to the RIC and we follow up on your case. In terms of that question, which is the next step, how do we do investigation? So first step would be to ask the customer, have you made your complaint? You should have a complaint number. Those things are recorded. We take some general information from the customer. We would then review it, and the customer is then informed. Either we would need or require some more information from them, or we let them know that we require some more information from the service provider. Based on just the general conversation or via the email thread, the information that we do have, the customer services department will then determine if they need to carry the issue to our technical operations department or other members of staff in terms of looking at it from a more, like probably an engineering or more technical slant. The customer service department in some cases will actually go out and do the investigation, either go to the customer's premises or actually go to the service provider to have further investigation be done. Once that's done, and at least I should say at every single stage of the process, the customer services personnel will actually communicate to the complainant so that they know what is actually happening. And I think that will now answer your second question in terms of how the investigation is pursued. Right? You also asked, and probably I'll go to the last before I go back to the third, which is how do we know when a customer is actually satisfied, right? So again, the RIC, after conduct of an investigation, wait for, in terms of notifying the service provider of the issue, will get the response of the service, will make obviously its judgment, submit that to the service provider. Once it gets the final decision in terms of the service provider, what's the next step to resolve the issue of the customer, that will be communicated to the said customer. And at that point in time, the customer can determine if they are satisfied or unsatisfied with the determination therein. If the customer is satisfied, well, the case is closed. If the customer is unsatisfied, we continue with some mediation. And if at the end of it, the result is that in the case, even with all that the RIC has done, that there is still a level of unsatisfaction, or dissatisfaction, I should say, by the customer, the RIC will then advise that complainant that they can actually carry their complaint, either write to the board further, just indicating that they're unsatisfied, or have other means outside of the RIC to challenge the result.
Remember, what I should say is that, remember, in every case, it's not always that the consumer is correct in what they are seeking to pursue. There are times, in fact, that the utility could actually be correct. And, in that case, what we try to do is to communicate with the customer and explain why their claim will more or less not go any further.
I gather that from the report that you would have shared, in that resolved could be in favor of the client's perspective, or sometimes from the industry's perspective. So I also wanted to ask a little bit of insight into withdrawal of complaints. Why do some complainants withdraw, and what are some of the circumstances around that?
I would say that there are various reasons why a customer may withdraw. Going into the minds of customers, that may be very difficult to say, but in some cases, a customer may make a complaint, and at the time of the complaint, let's say they would have made a complaint, let's say one of the cases that you may have, a complaint, not water. I didn't receive water, so you lodged your complaint with the organization. I have not received water in 2 weeks. We have taken your complaint, and then your problem is actually resolved by the service provider. So in some cases, customers will actually call and say, I would have received water, or the street light would have been fixed, and they would withdraw the complaint then. So in most instances, I can say from what we are aware of, it's that there was resolution.
Just a little further, because I hope we're not doing more harm than good here in this discussion, particularly as you have established a benchmark for what would constitute a complaint, in that it's certainly you're not the first port of call. That's very subjective. So how do you guide if you have a walk-in client, a member of the public, have a concern with an experience with my electricity or something related, or water? I could say I tried to call WASA this morning and didn't get through, and therefore I'm coming. How do you guide and determine what would constitute a client having gone through the initial steps and properly reverting to the commission?
Any customer that makes a complaint with the service provider is generally given there's generally a record in terms of a number that they are provided with. So that is utilized by the RIC to know that that complaint has been lodged with the service provider. So that's our first step in recognition that that complaint would have been made.
Thank you. And may I just, one other matter which I tend to ask would be to inquire on your degree of connection, interaction, collaboration with similar bodies across the region, or maybe further. Are you part of any connection, peer learning, or sharing of experiences within a regional context, or beyond that? Is that part of your experience?
So there is an association called the Association of Caribbean Utility Regulators. The RIC was actually one of the founding members there, and we've continued to serve on that body as part of the executive committee. We've always, it's not automatic, but we've always stepped forward to serve. So that actually provides two platforms for a kind of learning and training for the member countries. One being that we do share among ourselves, and in fact, right now I do have an invitation from the regulators in Jamaica for our regulatory body, our Board of Commissioners, to go there and have like a meeting with them. So that is something that, just subject to further meetings with our own board here in terms of what we want to pursue for 2024, that is available for us. That's a direct invitation. But through that body, we get other contacts. Somebody who was used or had access to resources, they will generally share and say, oh, this person helped me with a particular study. Let me give you a name and contact. So we do that as well. And in addition, OKUR puts on training. Some of that training is sponsored by, let's say, the developed countries, people who are advanced in terms of regulations. So right now there are a number of programs, 3 programs that are already carded for 2024. The first one is in March. We have 2 persons who will attend, 2 members of staff, that is, who will attend. And then, as I said, there are some others being planned.
Thank you very much for your responses. Chairman, I turn back to you.
Thank you. Just to follow up again, the executive director indicated that, and she used an example that segues into my concern with regards to WASA, complaints about not having water connection, or not having pipe-borne water, or not having access to truck-borne water supply. You mentioned that in terms of why people withdraw. But if you have a situation where you have multiple occasions in which the same condition arises, as I think exists in my constituency, so I don't want to politicize it, but it also exists in other parts of the country where we have repeated situations where persons are without water for extended periods of time. I know, for example, my office has received complaints, on average, about 100 complaints per month, often cycling every single month. Basically, the same set of people come in. And those are persons who would have made complaints to WASA. The question then is that what happens now, because we don't have the service standards, so we have no space for enforcement. Is that correct? But what happens then for WASA, who is now receiving these complaints? How does RIC treat with those complaints if they come only to WASA? It comes back to my question with regards to the need to publicize yourselves a little bit more aggressively so that the members of the public in particular, I think we have a fairly good control over the TNTech issue, but I don't think we have a fairly good control over the WASA issue, so that the service standards and the enforcement policy is not critical to ensure that members of the public get a good service. The question I'm trying to tie down is, how does an individual who has a repeated situation where every 2 weeks he has to plead with WASA for a truck bond supply because he is not getting a pipe bond supply, and that exists in a substantial part of Trinidad and Tobago, and I know that it exists in my constituency. So how does that person treat with that?
Given that if the QSS has not been given effect, it does not stop the RIC from still following up on the matters of customers. So if a customer does have an issue in terms of late water supply, no water supply, it doesn't matter whichever area in terms of supply of service, the RIC, once you make a report to your service provider, will follow up. So in terms of, as you said, there may not be at this point in time compensatory payment for a breach, because it's not a breach of a standard. But again, there are minimum levels of service that every customer is expected to have, and the RIC will follow up, and they have been, in terms of the customer service representatives. And you have said it is accepted that there are many persons that do have that issue recurrently, and they do call the RIC recurrently because sometimes the RIC is there as their last port of call. So they will call and they'd say, this is a problem that I'm having again, and the RIC staff in that department, very diligent, they continue, they call WASA, and they try to ensure that that customer can find some resolution or receive some resolution in that time. So recurrently it happens, and without fail, the RIC staff tries to ensure to find and to bring their issue to resolve.
Thank you. Well answered. Just to follow up on a question that my colleague here asked with regards to the numbers of the complaints. Would you, by chance, have more recent numbers? These are 2014 and 2015 numbers that we were looking at. And the numbers admittedly are very low, but those would be the persons reporting. Would you have an indication of more recent complaints and how they have, whether the resolved percentages still as good as it was then, or whether it has not been resolved, etc.?
We do have recent numbers. As up to 2022, the total number of complaints were 2,589 for the year. And yes, it's recognized that the number of complaints, given what we know and hear in society, should be or expected to be a lot more than that. But those are the complaints that have come into the RIC. And the resolution rate, it's actually 90th percentage in terms of that. So the customer service department has kept that level of diligence in resolving complaints. Just to give a bit of, and they actually track their stats so that we know as an organization the response there. Once a customer makes a complaint, 99% of the time, the RIC responds within the same day. In 99% of the cases, there is actually a follow-up, right, within the week, and it's around 84%, if I recall that number exactly, where customers have received resolution in under 25 days.
Is your complaint procedure online? Is it an online or is it a telephone complaint that has happened?
The complaint can be via various channels, so you can make it online, in person, via WhatsApp, via the website. So every channel that is available, the 800 number, we accept the complaints as the RIC is the second call of redress once you have made your first complaint through the service provider.
Thank you. Can I then, it is my view, I think it is our view generally, that the numbers of complaints are understated. And maybe a lot more effort has to be put in terms of reaching out to members of the public and advertising your responsibilities and your role in having some of these things resolved ASAP. Specifically, I can tell you that in some of my areas, you will be getting a lot more feedback from them. Maybe this 2,500 that you had for 2022 will only come from that one area in South. And that will only generally be about WASA at this point. Like I said, I think we're doing fairly well with TNTech in terms of the solution of the complaints rate, but an increased marketing and increased presence in the public domain will allow more persons to express their opinion. I want to turn over now to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Calendar and RIC team for attending. Coming off of what the Chairman just said, I looked at your status of implementation of the strategic plan, which is good. A lot of people write their plan and they don't manage and monitor it, so I congratulate you on that. What we have before us, I don't know how current it is, how up to date it is, but I'm still going to ask my questions out of it. You have pages 1 to 7. And I'll start from item 2, which deals with the QSS, the quality of service standards that the director just spoke of, and wondered if it is you have completed that, and you completed it since February 12th of 2021, and you felt it was important enough to update it, revised it up to December 19, 2023, so that is good also. Do you think WASA has this document, I assume? How do you, is there a gap analysis or review, or you manage, you oversee this whole QSS? Because I think that will also help if they are looking at the gaps based on your own benchmarking. I think that will be taken up in the quality of standards also. It will be based on some level of benchmarking. I hope, and we are watered down to say, well, because Trinidad is third world and we this and we that. No, we can't do that. We have to aspire to something. Well, I see my colleague here looking at me. Are we developing? We're not third world. Where are we? We understand. You understand? So I'm just saying, we don't want to compete with our standards, because people are crying every day. So I'm just asking, how do you manage this gap between what you are saying? These are the minimum standards, taking into account, my model takes into account for the fact that our budgeting, our economic realities, or this or that. So this is what we are willing to accept. Your gap, do you manage a gap? Is there a gap?
In relation to that item, which is line 2, the resubmission, in a sense, wasn't based on an evaluation of specific gaps because it hasn't actually been effected, right? In terms of giving the QSS a life, it has to be gazetted first. The reason for the resubmission is in terms of from the first time the QSS has been submitted to the MPU for gazetting till now, there has always been, I would say some changes in terms of persons or stakeholders having their opinions in terms of meeting those standards. And the regulator always has that very hard and difficult role of, as you say, balancing the needs of both parties, the customers and the service provider. And definitely to basically carry your sentiment, it's really not at that point to just water it down and say, well, we know you are here, so let's just have standards that are minimal and almost, I would say, not good enough. The RIC will always put forward standards that have a good level of service and it's generally very comparative to what you would see internationally. Given our context, yes, but good standards, because when we look at standards internationally, there are some that are actually very, very poor and just service levels that really would not be acceptable by the customer, because at the end of the day, we are accountable to those customers as well. So the services in terms of the utilities that they provide, that QSS has to have some minimal level of standard, and that standard has to be something that can be, the organization as well could be held to account by the customer.
Thank you. Which brings me to, I want to add my voice to my other colleagues with respect to giving your role in the community as the middleman stakeholder, as it were, where people see you as, well, they saw you as an independent stakeholder. And I see the chairman would have gleaned from the outing in the consultations that basically you moved from people not knowing you to telling themselves that you wield the big stick. Right, and I don't know if there is where you want to be, because people really wanted to see you as an independent, dealer or broker, as it were, looking after the interests of the consumer, the end user, at the end of the day. Which brings me to I'm jumping to item 15 now, on this same, what do you call it? The management of your strategic plan, the public perception survey of the RIC. And the project description is the survey conducted by the independent consultant to measure public awareness of the RIC as well as the effectiveness of the communication strategy and overall quality of the RIC's work. I don't know if this went in there after you all would have done the consultation, or that was always there, because what happened out there in the consultation must have been a wake-up call. Because certainly, I mean, one could do the morning quarterbacking, but certainly if one would have gone out prior to, people might have said, I don't know about you at all, or I don't have a favorable view of you, as the case might be. I don't know what it would have been. What are you going to do now? Because this is in progress, a work in progress. How soon do you expect this work to be completed, and what are you going to do with it?
This actually didn't. This came on in terms of this line item for project as part of the 2020 to 2024 strat plan, so it was there prior. And the reason it's there, the RIC generally conducts a public perception survey. One was conducted in 27 for the RIC, looking at the public's perception and awareness of the RIC. So the survey goes out to determine the number of persons that are aware of the RIC, the function, the role of the RIC, and to also ask questions in terms of how they would prefer to have the RIC engage with them. So if they are aware of the RIC, what methods have they identified that they see us in the press? Did they see us on social media? And based on that question, the follow-up as well, how would you prefer to have the RIC engage with you? In terms of the timeline for the next public perception survey, that is going to happen in the first quarter of this year. It will be conducted. The reason for in progress, the draft survey has already been developed, but given that consultations were ongoing during that time, as you say, us looking like the big bad wolf with the big stick, we decided we'll have that run after the consultations have ended, and so first quarter we would see that.
I have two more questions. But so, given that outcome in the actual operationalizing of your function, you know, that interaction with the public, which you really don't usually do, being the regulator, I'm just wondering whether in listening to you talk about the complaints and that you are the person of last resort, as it were, but a lot of stuff is going on with the providers. You know, some of the complaints just fall by the wayside, as the case might be. You think will it be better to have a process that is better managed, and not kind of by the way we look on social media, we probably listen on the radio, and if somebody happened to come to us, is there any way, I'm just asking, maybe that's not possible, given the law, the policies, or what have you, that it gives you no business in the operational business. But I just want to know, is there a way that you can manage it a little better than that?
That is one of the areas that we, in terms of corporate communication, in terms of the whole of organization and alongside the board, have been looking at reviewing what we currently do. And the reality is that the organization has taken several steps to bring awareness to the public. So we do the organization has radio campaigns. They go on different television programs, radio programs, in addition to social media boosts, etc. And the organization actually does outreach. So they actually do outreach at different locations, and that is advertised so that persons can actually come to meet the members of the RIC, bring their complaints, know more about the RIC. Those have happened. The organization has also had different campaigns in which we involve school children. So there have been school tours. Most recently, we actually engage the schools in Trinidad and Tobago by having school children basically provide the RIC with different depictions of what they would like to see as our mascot. So we actually have Pluggy and Tappy, and they would have provided some responses to us in terms of what they see as environmental, why this mascot, what is the representation for the RIC. So we have utilized different channels, and I take it that we do need to do some more work and find some different ways to fine-tune what we have been doing to get more customers to acknowledge us as their port of call for any issues that they have.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one last thing. I just want to ask one. And item 6 and 7, I saw where you had your price review. Well, it was concluded in the case of T&Tech. WASA is still ongoing. However, in item 13, the project is the economic appraisal of the long-term capital maintenance needs of WASA. And the description is asset management, etc., which is, well, it calls for capital. Isn't that an item you pick up when you are trying to determine a suitable rate or tariff, as the case might be? And if it has not started, I just wondering how we came to the end of 6 and 7, and this has not yet started.
13, in terms of that, would not have been started because that obviously, as you rightly said, would occur as you're looking at capital and while you're doing the rate review to look at tariffs. At this point in time, because the T&Tech has been completed, that will be, completed therein, but WASA has not been completed just yet. So,
but it's ongoing, but this has not started.
So in terms of the economic appraisal of the long-term maintenance, that will require us to be looking at the capital expenditure, and at that point in time, it has not been started because it will require us to be going through the business plan, etc. So once that is in at that point coming to completion, that project will be started and completed therein.
Right, so just for clarification, so that means that you will be doing that as part of the continuation of this item 7 price review under WASA. So you will be looking at the item 13, the economic appraisal of the long term. It will form part of your appraisal. Is that correct?
Yes.
I will allow my colleague.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the entities for coming before this committee. My question would fall right in line with compliance risk, and I would like to know, based on your submission, service providers operating in the water and electricity sector are or should be listed under the second schedule of the RIC. Who remains unrepresented are the Trinidad and Tobago or the Trinidad Generation Unlimited, TGU, Desalcott, and 7 Seas, as they are not listed in the first schedule of the RIC Act. Could you please inform this committee, 1, who is responsible for regulating Trinidad Generation Unlimited, Desalcott, and 7 Seas? Has any consideration ever been given to amend the RIC Act to include these entries as in the first schedule? And if yes, what was the result, or what is the result of these considerations?
So, remember, those particular bodies are I wouldn't use the term regulated because regulation has a specific context, but they operate in accordance with their contractual arrangement between them and the service provider. So TGU, for example, will have a direct contractual arrangement between themselves and TNTech, and then the other companies you call there regarding water, they have direct arrangements with WASA. The RIC has actually applied over many years, this is an ongoing issue, to bring those companies within the first schedule, because I think just the environment would be a more even environment. All the companies subject to the same kind of review would be preferred. I don't recall when was the last time we made that initiative. It probably is part of that same review of the Act that we were talking about with respect to what we would like to see happen. We've not had any success with that thus far, but we would see it as something that is desirable, a desirable industry framework within which everyone is operating, and so we will continue to pursue, give the recommendation and the justification as to why it should occur.
Chairman, just a follow-up question. Given your response, do you have a projected timeline that you wish to achieve such?
Yesterday would not be too soon. We really would like the industry to be more even and everybody to be subjected to regulations. I think it's just preferable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Just for clarification, I don't know if you want to provide some basic guideline. Again, coming from the queries raised by my colleague and comments made by yourself at the RIC. At the consultations that we had before, persons were of the view that the RIC's rule was something specific, and we now know that's a little bit different. Can you, for clarification, advise in November 1st, 2023, based on your strat plan, you completed the price review of TNTech. Just for clarification, because I attended several of these consultations, and I was aware that persons were of the view that RIC is raising the rates, but that your rule is for the calculation and estimation. What happens after you submit your report? Just for clarification. So your role in terms of doing the price review, how is it initiated, and what happens thereafter?
Right, so I'll start with the end and
yes, please.
begin with, right. So it's initiated by the RIC putting out its framework and approach and the requests for the business plan. Once the business plan is received, the RIC staff will then review and assess the business plan in areas where there are questions that will be posed to the service provider. They would make amendments accordingly, and when the RIC is satisfied with their final submission, then we call that the submission of the final business plan. That is then utilized. The RIC currently uses the revenue cap mechanism, and utilizing that, the revenue requirement is calculated, etc., tariffs at the end. Those tariffs are considered to be maximum tariffs. So at this point, the RIC sets the maximum rates that the utility can charge. That is determined or stated in the final determination, along with other compliance mechanisms in there. And that is then put forward to, in terms of once it's published and give life, that is put forward to the utility, who can then determine the rates and charges. But they cannot charge more than, because we set the maximum rates, but they can charge that or anything less.
Thank you. But in your submissions, again, to the committee, I saw something that says that the RIC Act places direct functional responsibility upon the Commission to consult with all stakeholders and to have regard to the public interest, and in particular, and this is the point I wanted to raise, and in particular, maximum efficiency in the use and allocation of resources, and that services are reliable and provided at the lowest possible cost. But you just indicated that your proposal is based on the maximum tariff chargeable.
Let me clarify in terms of that. So the maximum rates that they can charge, the maximum rates that they can charge are aligned to the lowest possible cost. So one of the things in regulation is that when someone hears revenue requirements, your first port of call is to think money that they're going to make. But the money that is determined in terms of their revenue is actually derived from looking at the cost, and that is the efficient cost of the utility. So when the regulator looks at that business plan submission, they are looking at it from the cost perspective, the efficiency part of it. So they look at operating expenditure, we look at the efficient level of operating expenditure that the firm or the utility basically would have to expend to provide that level of service. We look at capital expenditure. It's again efficient level of capital expenditure that would have the utility provide these services. So once the RIC determines what is the efficient level in terms of minimal level of cost. So when we look at minimum, it is in terms of the cost. And that's why when we have the business plan submission, the utility in some cases may ask for more than the RIC would have approval for, because the RIC only approves its efficient cost. And that efficient cost is basically the sum of, or the value that the RIC would determine as their revenue requirement. So they are only able to earn what is equivalent to their efficient cost. And once we have that, then we look at the cost of service study to determine how that sum is going to be derived from the different customer classes, and then that's brought down to the tariff that we see. So the maximum tariff that the RIC set is equivalent to the lowest cost that the utility should have, let's say the highest cost based on efficiency, and therefore that therein lies that discussion of maximum revenue. That maximum revenue should match the lowest cost in terms of efficiency.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done. In your strat plan, you indicated that one of the considerations that RIC focuses on is regulation that is fair to all customers. And in item 3.1.3, that is on page 13, you specify that the protection of vulnerable groups is always a key concern for any regulator, and the RIC has put measures in place for disadvantaged customers, although these have sometimes been proven inadequate. Can you indicate what sort of measures you have put in place for disadvantaged customers, and what you thought, why do you think they were inadequate, and what, so 3 questions. What exactly you put in place for disadvantaged customers, why you thought that they were inadequate, and what measures have you put in place to ensure that they are no longer inadequate?
And you're saying that's on page 13 in terms of inadequate?
Item 3.1.3, it's a regulation that is fair to all customers.
On page 13, 3.1.3. Okay, I can, from the perspective of the rates, what the RIC would put into place, firstly, 4 rates, is to ensure that there's that, which is what we call the lifeline tariff, which is really in the first tier. And that lifeline tariff is firstly one place to ensure that for that, I would say, minimal average level of service, that those rates are generally the lowest. The assumption then, and it's an assumption, but the assumption there is that persons that will really fall in that tariff category, that first band, are generally those that are considered to be customers that are most vulnerable. They have the lower level in terms of their consumption, in terms of their usage of electricity. So that's the first thing. First thing off, setting tariffs, and that's why we would have that tiered system and not a fully flat system. The tiered system allows that first level to meet with a lower tariff level for that those groups of customers. In addition to that, the RIC would have things in terms of codes of practice, in terms of directives to the utility to provide for persons that may have different levels of hardship at different times. So in terms of how you disconnect, putting things in place for customers, having payment plans, those are some of the things that we would discuss with the utility to ensure that persons who may be vulnerable would have some level of recourse there. Outside of that, I'm not saying that one in terms of, and that's the only thing I'm not saying in terms of inadequate. Inadequate at the point on page 13 really responds to the fact that the current tariffs are inadequate because in terms of fairness, we look at it from twofold, right? In terms of fairness of rates, we look at it from the customer perspective. So you have the lifeline rate, and in addition to that, there is a World Bank, I would say benchmark or target that many regulators look at, and it is to ensure that your expenditure on electricity is no more than, in terms of 10% of your overall expenditure as a customer. So the RIC will also look at that target to say, well, okay, generally, we are not burdening in customers too much, and we have something in place for the vulnerable. But in terms of inadequacy, as part of ensuring that customers are met with a high-quality service, we also have to ensure that there is longevity for the utility so that they can provide that service. So there must be that level of in terms of the RIC being responsible to ensure that the service provider can meet its efficient cost.
Well done. Again, following up on my colleague who raised the issue with regard to the strat plan and some of the items that were listed as incomplete. Some of those items in your strategic plan would have straddled several previous strategic plans, and therefore we would have still have focused on them because we would have seen that they were important enough to be put as an item for consideration on the strat plan between 2020 and 2024. Some of those are very, 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 very critical. Publish RIC's views on the legal, institutional, and governance arrangements for the water and for electricity and the water and wastewater sector. Not started. Well, we spoke about the economic appraisal before. That's not started, but you indicated that that will be a work to fall into line when you get further along the line of the price review of WASA. Item 14, a regulatory reporting and compliance manual for TNTEC and WASA. That too is pegged to the rate review, correct? But there are two others that I'm very curious about, which are listed as not started in your implementation of the deliverables for 2020-2024 strat plan that you provided as part of your submission to the committee. Item 20, customer satisfaction survey of services provided by TNTEC and WASA. The project description, an external third party will be contracted to conduct the survey measuring customer satisfaction of the service provided by WASA and TNTEC. That is listed as not started. There's a paper on affordability of electricity and water services in Trinidad and Tobago. That too is listed as not started. Both of those, in theory, should inform any evaluation listed in item 6 and 7, which is the price review. Both of those should be used for guiding your way forward. Now, you've stated that these are not started here. Is it that the intention is to have them started and completed so that they will inform your rate review, or at least with regards to WASA, which is in progress, or is it that these were simply not started for another reason?
Item 20, customer satisfaction survey for these services. This is not started because it wasn't intended, even at the plan, it's intended to occur after. So we have a rate review completed. You potentially would possibly see increases in prices. So completion of rate review, if prices have increased or they have stayed the same, once we have completed our price review, the aim thereafter is to look at customer satisfaction. Because with any review, it's twofold, right? The RIC doesn't look at the review of prices simply to increase prices. They increase prices if they are prevalent, it is to be matched with an increase in service. Because again, the cost is the revenue, which had to be matched with what the service provider is supposed to provide to the customers. And therefore, we can now hold them to account because they have been provided with the revenue to conduct their work. So that happens after. So now that we have completed the price review for TNTech, then that will start. The contractual arrangements there to have a third party do that, those things can generally happen very quickly. So now that the price review has been conducted, this will actually happen in 2024. Right?
Understood, but shouldn't there be a benchmark? Shouldn't you be able to compare? How would you know if things have gotten better or worse? Shouldn't there be a before and a after? Because you're doing an assessment of customer satisfaction after the rate increase.
There was a customer satisfaction. So in 2017, we looked at our public perception, and in 2021, the RIC actually conducted a survey on with customers on the service providers.
In 2021?
In 2021.
I have not seen those results. Is that those results are public, or is that in-house?
That would be, I would have to get that from the corporate. I'm not too sure at this point in time, so that is something that I can provide to you at a later date. I know that those results are generally out, and we can provide that. 21, which is the paper on affordability of the electricity and water services in Trinidad and Tobago. The aim of that paper is to look at the impact in terms of elasticity of demand and so forth. And because there's not sufficient data, because in terms of the last price increase that would have happened in regards to electricity, that occurred in 2009. And because that occurred in 2009, they would not have sufficient data for the preceding years to conduct such analysis. And with the rate review, that would allow the RIC to have such data to work on that paper. Right? We did have some delays in the completion of that. If not, it may have already been started. But now that that is completed, those two items can now proceed.
Thank you. My final question, at least as at now, in your SWOT analysis, the RIC listed in its weaknesses: human resource constraints, inadequate monitoring capabilities, need for review and expansion of enforcement powers, organizational structure and staffing not fully aligned with strategic priorities. I have that listed because I printed these individual pages as opposed to the whole block, but I have that listed as part of the strat plan of 2020 to 2024. So this SWOT analysis, I'm hoping that this is not true. Now, this SWOT analysis existed for the strat plan for 2020-2024? No?
Given the question asked us, we looked at it from a current perspective. It's given that we would have provided the strategic plans here. Those aspects some of them are relatively new. So one would have been prior in terms of looking at the overall structure.
So these are current. These
Yes.
concern weaknesses, these identified weaknesses are current.
Weaknesses are current.
So in terms of human resource constraints, what are those?
Right, so human resource constraints, we do have some vacancies that the RIC will be looking to fill, and that has been identified. It is something that the HR manager and managers here would have been looking at, and that has been brought to the board, and soon the organization will be filling those vacancies to ensure that we have the staffing requirement for the work.
How many vacancies are there, and at what levels?
There are vacancies
6 and 7.
We currently have 12 vacancies, and the vacancies are at various levels within the organization, but mostly at the lower management sort of points within the organization. We're professional, well, we have some professionals.
But in your view, because you've identified it as a weakness, in your view, has this impacted upon the organization's ability to effectively function and fulfill its mandate?
At this point, no, the vacancies, actually some of them are very current. So given that we had that staff component, the organization is able to carry out its mandate. It's now recognized, and as I said recently, because we know that we need to push to fill those vacancies to ensure that we can continue to fill our mandate.
Just remind me, you said there were how many vacancies? 12?
12.
You have an organizational structure with a staff complement of 39?
39.
So 12 out of 39 is a substantial amount of persons that are missing.
Yes.
But you're convinced that that has not adversely affected your efficiency?
In terms of an efficiency, because as the 12 vacancies, a couple of them happened within the last 5 to 6 months.
Okay.
And the persons who have been there are now at the upper management and the executive team. One of the key strong points of the organization is that many of our staff under the senior level have been there for over 20 years. So they have they have all of the organization's history, the understanding, the regulatory expertise. So with the coming of those vacancies, we have had to depend heavily on those very skilled and knowledgeable staff members.
Thank you.
Chair, if I may be allowed to add that the number of vacancies is something that we will be moving to address quite soon. Of course, the persons who are there, we had work to do, we had deadlines to meet, and they've risen to the occasion. But of course, it's not sustainable that we will kind of call on those staff members. The interesting thing, though, about having that level of vacancy coming out of the last public consultations and really just completing a rate review, as I think we all know that the RIC has not completed a lot of rate reviews before. So it's kind of an opportune moment. It's not desirable from a staffing standpoint to burden the persons there too much, but it's also opportune in that we've learned a lot about what is required now in terms of doing a rate review, so that we will use that information and filter that in with respect to the kind of organization that we want to forge. And just to give you one example, somebody was asking before, well, how do you determine if these standards and the reporting from TNTech and so on, if that is adequate? One of the things that I felt coming out of the rate review is that we must get closer to our service providers, and we must have persons who can go in there more regularly and become more intimate with what they're doing. So that is the vacancies allow us to kind of craft a job description in that direction. Other than that, it's quite possible that we may have just filled the vacancies, just turn them over with what we had before. But I think it's a bit fortunate that we can use what we've just learned in kind of crafting and the organization that we want.
So is that the logic behind this other weakness, the organizational structure and staffing not aligned fully with the strategic priorities? Is that what you meant? That the strategic priorities would now have changed based on your consultations, etc. So you need different support staff, etc. And you are now going to realign your structure. So we can look forward to seeing a change in the organizational structure itself to reflect these new priorities?
Oh, certainly. And, as I did say at the beginning, that we see ourselves as a learning organization, and that really wasn't just a platitude. I think as we have done more and more work, we've discovered the importance of research and us being, in a sense, thought leaders of some of the things that we want to promote in the country. So those vacancies would allow us that opportunity, filling them with respect to the alignment with the strategy.
Final, before I turn over to my colleagues, you indicated that many of your senior officers now have been there for a long time, and therefore they understand the system, etc. Mm-hmm. So you move them up, which is why we have the vacancies at the lower level. How is employment at RIC done? Is it internally sourced, or do you have to advertise? Are you required by law to advertise? Do you have to go through the service commissions, the various institutions? Although I know you're an independent organization, but how, if I want a job at RIC, well, not me, but if an individual is seeking a job at the RIC, how do they apply?
We advertise our positions, and so we take applications from members of the public. And I think we do what, in my view, this is just my personal view, what good organizations do, which is that we begin that process with an internal advertisement, and we look at our staff members there. And once they have achieved the standards, we are quite willing to promote them. Now, of course, that requires that in order for them to be ready, that we review their performance, we give them feedback, we give them training, as the case might be. And once they are attaining the standards, we're very willing and open to promote them.
Who makes the decision?
Well, we have a performance management system, and in the system, your performance is recorded. I think because people have been there for a while, they do tend to know their staff members and so on. So it's really done through a structured process, the performance management system.
Sure, thank you. I want to turn over to Member let me let Member Monroe first and then come back to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just a question to the Auditor General Department. I would like to know if the Auditor General Department has ever been called upon to assess the RIC proposed cess rate as provided by Section 33 of the RIC Act.
Well, I'm not sure if we have ever been invited, but I'm pretty sure we never made any recommendations or responded to any such question.
Thank you very much for your clarity.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at your reporters, where you stated that, following on from what Mr. Chairman's line of questioning just now, retraining staff has been a challenge for the RIC as highly skilled and trained staff are lost to other regulatory agencies and utilities locally, regionally, and internationally. This is at least in part because the RIC is unable to match the packages offered internationally compared to the nationally approved packages. You stated also that in your 2016-2018 strategic objective to develop an employee retention program to retain and reward employees, it was listed as not achieved. As it was not deferred, it is therefore not part of the 2020-2024 work plan submitted to the committee. So you're not pursuing that. When I put that against an amazing statement, which speaks to your competence or operation, you said, in quoting, first of all, the legislation says Section 29 of the RIC Act provides the following. The funds and resources of the Commission shall consist of such amounts as may be received by the Commission in respect of A, amounts as may be appropriated by Parliament until the Commission attains self-sufficiency. And then comes the amazing statement. The RIC submission indicated that having achieved self-sufficiency, the Commission does not apply for or receive any government subvention, which must please the Minister of Finance very much. So, on the one hand, you are unable to retain employees because you have not been able, you don't have the wherewithal to do so. Yet, there is a potential for achieving self-sufficiency, for achieving your objective by following what the Act has put for you, Section 29, where you can get money from Parliament. But you choose not to do that because you say you're self-sufficient. So how on the one hand you're self-sufficient, and on the other hand you can't meet the requirements for your employee retention? I am puzzled. Now, I'm sure you have some formula, you have some way that you've achieved this self-sufficiency, which you can share, because everybody wants part of the financial pie. But you're saying, oh, it's available to me, but I'm leaving that alone. So I am a little puzzled.
Sorry, my apologies. Let me ask the CFO to speak about how the RIC obtains its funding, which is through CES, and CES is actually provided based on the RIC's budget and then charged to the service provider, but he could explain to you in greater detail. With respect to the RIC's salaries, those salaries are not set independent of the RIC. We go through the HR committee, the government CPO and the HR committee in terms of determining what those salaries are. So we are subject to that limitation. And through you, Chair and Member, if we were to try to match what persons have gotten internationally, we would be here for a different reason, because those are very high and favorable packages when we have actually four of the vacancies where we've lost persons recently, they have gone internationally. We could not possibly match those packages. So if I could, let me just get the CFO to talk a little bit more in terms of our funding, so that there's some clarity on that, and then we can speak about what flexibility we have with respect to setting salaries, yes? So,
CFO, I just want to make it clear. I'm not expecting you to match internationally, because the people who, most of them are leaving and staying here.
The last four persons who left have gone internationally.
Yeah, but you had more than 4 people leaving over the time, yes. All right. Sure.
Thank you. Good morning again. The RIC budget is set according to the costs that the RIC would expect to incur over the next year. And this is built up. Let me address specifically salaries. It is aligned to the limits as set by the minister who obtains those salaries from the CPO. So it is from that the budget is built, and then we receive, in addition to the other expenses of the commission, we receive that from the service providers according on a percentage basis from their cumulative revenue. Right. With respect to the funding, we attained sufficiency in 2004, so therefore we do not require or request any monies through subventions from the government, and we are fully self-sufficient on cess income from the service providers. Thank you.
All right. I think we have no more questions for you all, and therefore it falls onto me to thank you all. Sorry?
I'm trying to wrap my mind around their concept of self-sufficiency.
All right, so it falls upon me to thank you all very much today for your presence here and your willingness to provide information as required and requested. It's been a pleasure engaging you all. I just want to remind the RIC of our committee's recommendation that a little bit more public relations outreach is done, because I think if you do that, you will probably get a lot more complaints, but you will get a lot more satisfied members of the public that something is being done to treat with some of the concerns they have, particularly about WASA. Thank you all again. At this point, we will break camera coverage, live coverage, and I want to thank you to facilitate your exit, at least from the chamber. But thank you all very much again. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely.
Sorry. Thank you for the very probing questions. We have actually taken notes where concerns have been expressed, and we will actually be utilizing it in terms of what we do in 2024 and as we do our new strategic plan for the next